Welcome back to the Middle-Aged Hack channel. I am Stuart and I am a middle-aged hack. Just a child of the 80s trying to make his way through the 20s, just like all of us. Are you ready to take the journey with me? Well, if you've watched a bunch of my videos, you've probably figured out that I don't know what this channel is going to be about quite yet. I talk about stuff that's interesting to me, and I talk about stuff that I know about, and I do some tutorial stuff, some reviews, and I'm just basically trying to see what sticks. I want to build a good channel. I want to build a channel that you like, and I don't want to resort to stuff like, just cheap tricks and politics and stuff like that. These things get a lot of views, but I don't feel really good about making them. And I don't think that you feel really good about watching them. So when I've talked to my friends, they say, well, tell stories about what you know. And one of the things I know about is typesetting. You see, before I was a YouTuber, even before I was an online creator, I was a typesetter. There's a whole story here which will tell you kind of my story, why I got into typesetting and print production, and why I eventually got out. The story for today is about something that you see every day and you think about maybe 1/10 of a second a day. It's so common that you don't even see it. And that is Times New Roman. Times New Roman is all around us. It's on our computers. Because it's on our computers, it's on signage, it's everywhere. And I hope by the end of this video to convince you that you should stop using it whenever possible. In order to do that, I have to tell you where Times New Roman came from, why it's even called Times New Roman, and how it got to be everywhere. The story begins in the 1930s. This was a time of incredible change and creativity, and people were rethinking everything, sometimes for the good and sometimes for the bad. But they were thinking about the design of things and what things should look like, oftentimes for the first time. They were doing things like standardizing the size of paper and creating new type styles that expressed not only the feeling at the time, but were more useful for the tasks that they were created for. It used to be way back in the 18th and 19th centuries, well, somebody would create a font because that's what they thought it should look like, and they liked it, and some of these fonts ended up being good, and most of them ended up being garbage. It was in the 1930s that people started thinking about the use that a font would be put to and what it would need for that case. And that takes us to 1931. In 1931, a type designer named Stanley Morrison was hired by the London Times to create a new typeface. They wanted something that was legible, but their old fonts were legible too. They wanted something, however, that worked really well with the technology that they had. See, the way that newspapers were created at that time was using one of these. This is a linotype. And believe it or not, it was the height of modern technology in the 1930s. Here's how it worked. A person would sit there and type out an entire line of type, get it? Without a screen. They had no idea what they were doing except for what was in their head. Then they'd push a button, and I swear I am not making this up. Well, a bunch of molds would get put together inside the machine, hot lead would be poured into the molds, and then it would cool and it would slide out in the bottom, and you'd have this line of type that was ready to get locked in one line at a time. And that's how newspapers were made. The people at the Times gave Stanley Morrison two directives. First of all, it should work really well with a linotype machine. And second of all, it should allow for longer stories. The longer stories part was pretty easy. Morrison designed Times New, which was what they called the font, not Times New Roman, and I'll explain that in a minute. Morrison designed Times New so that it actually takes up less space. When you set something in Times New, it takes up a lot less space than it does in a font like Bookman, which was popular at the time. This is actually good for newspapers because it means they have to cut less. Journalists like to ramble on and on and on. And so they had to cut less in order to fit a story in a particular size. Oftentimes, when you were creating a story, well, later on in the process, they would want to bold or italic something. And that's kind of the magic of Times. The magic of the Times New font is that the italics take up exactly the same amount of space as the regular letters. And the bold italics take up the same amount of space as the bold. No other font that I know of does this. And if it does, pretty sure Times New was the first one to do it. Now, why do they call it Times New Roman today instead of just Times New? Well, there's a whole bunch of moving parts to that. First thing is to try to understand what Roman means. Roman is an old typesetter's term for a font that has serifs on it and these little feet at the bottom of the font. If it doesn't, an old typesetter would call that Gothic. But I'll make a video about Gothic fonts another day. So Times New, just without it being italic, without it being bold or bold italic, that was Times New Roman. And technically, the italic version was called Times New Italic. The bold version was called Times New Bold. You get the idea. But as time wore on, people started calling it Times New Roman. At least the people who bought it from a particular company. Times New Roman was sold by the Monotype Corporation, which was just one maker of fonts in those days. Another maker was Linotype, the same people who made the Big Ugly Machine. Well, Linotype wanted their own version of Times because it was popular with newspapers for the exact same reason that was popular with the London Times. And here's the secret. Copyright law says that you can copyright the name of a font, and if it's made of computer code, you can copyright the computer code, but that comes much later. But you cannot copyright the appearance of a font. If I take one of the most popular fonts in the world and hand remake it into all new computer code without ever using the original computer code, I can sell it as my own as long as I don't use the original name. Well, Linotype came up with their own version, which they just called Times instead of Times New, and they were off to the races. And there's a slight difference between Times and Times New, but it's so small you'll never even notice. It's like the points on the end of stuff, and normal people will never see the difference. Every manufacturer of fonts had their own version of Times because it was popular and because newspapers wanted it, and newspapers were a big part of the printing market in those days. Another very popular one, which I believe was made by Agfa, they're still out there making film, by the way, was called Dutch, or Dutch Roman. I'm not 100% sure why it was called Dutch Roman, but I have an idea. At the time, Dutch was kind of a slang term for cheap or stingy, and because Times Roman takes up less space, well, that makes it kind of stingy. And so they called it Dutch Roman. You know now why Times New was created, but the real question is, why is it everywhere today? In order to understand that, you need to leave the 1930s way behind. You need to go to the 1980s. In the 1980s, printing was done very differently. There were dot matrix printers and the very beginnings of laser printers. Laser printers had relatively good quality compared to other sorts of printers. Everybody kind of wanted that. But each laser printer used its own language to try to send information to it. And that meant that every computer had to be programmed specially to work with that printer. Well, a bunch of engineers didn't think that was a good idea, and they came up with a common printer language they called PostScript. PostScript let you draw shapes, it let you send type at different sizes, and it let you have different downloadable fonts. This became a great idea, but it didn't actually happen until Apple got involved. Apple was creating a new computer, and they wanted a printer for it, but they didn't want to have to develop the printer. They bought the insides of HP LaserJets and then put in custom programming from a company called Adobe, who owned PostScript, to run them. And then they licensed the fonts. Now, they could have licensed them from Monotype, except they didn't. They licensed them from Linotype Hell. That was the name of the company at that time. And that means they got all of the Linotype versions of the most common fonts. They picked what they thought were some of the most beautiful fonts ever made. Palatino, Bookman, Avant-Garde, which Avant-Garde had only been out for about 10 years at that time, and it was incredibly popular in the 1980s. And then, well, they wanted to have one more font. They wanted to have a font that just kind of fit in there. But, you know, the amount of memory in these chips, it just wasn't that much. They needed something they could really cram in there. And they turned to a font that would take up less computer code. They turned to Times. You see, laser printers use something called a hinting table to make sure that the fonts look legible at different sizes. If not, all the letters would look super smushed together at tiny sizes and really horsey at really large sizes. So they use what are called hinting tables to define the spaces between the letters. Hinting tables take up memory. And they said, okay, can we come up with a font that has a smaller hinting table than these other fonts like Bookman and Avant-Garde? Well, it turns out, because you see, remember how Times Italic takes up the same space as Times Roman? Well, it turns out you only need one hinting table for the regular and one hinting table for the bold. That's half the amount of computer code, and that allowed them to fit the Times font into the original LaserWriter. Why do you care? Because you don't have a Macintosh? Well, it turns out the people at Microsoft really liked what Apple was doing, and they wanted to do something similar. They built font support into Windows 3.1, and they did it with a competitor to PostScript that they called TrueType. And there's another whole story to be told there. I'll maybe do that in another video. But they basically wanted to do everything that Apple was doing without paying Apple any money and without paying anybody that Apple was paying. So some of the fonts for it, they created themselves, and some of the fonts they licensed from our old friends at Monotype. One of the fonts they licensed was Monotype Times New Roman. They wanted a set of fonts that could replace the Adobe fonts that were used by Apple one for one. When Windows did this, it set up these fonts as basically a standard, because you got these fonts free with Windows, and other fonts would cost you like $80, which is like $360 today, just for one font. People stuck with the ones that they got for free and didn't really think about it otherwise. This is about the same time that the World Wide Web started becoming a thing. And when they created the first web browsers, they used fonts that were available on Windows machines, because if the web was going to get anywhere, it had to be compatible with Windows. And so they used Times New Roman. Times New Roman is still the default font used for web pages if you don't specify any font. If you just put in plain HTML code, well, you're going to get it in Times New Roman, even today. And because the World Wide Web took off, I hardly need to tell you that, became incredibly popular, Times New Roman became incredibly popular. It became everywhere. And that's where we are today. Now, I want to tell you that you should never use Times New Roman, because you're not running a newspaper in the 1930s. Times New Roman isn't that good. It doesn't convey a lot of emotion. There are a lot better fonts that do. And chances are one of them is already on your computer. One of the other fonts that was created for use in Microsoft Windows was Palatino Linotype. And Palatino was originally created by a guy named Herman Zapp, one of the greatest type creators to ever walk the earth. Not just in my opinion, you can read up on him. Palatino has been called the most beautiful font ever created, not just by me, by a lot of folks, but I do tend to agree. And I hope that instead of using Times New Roman from now on, you'll use Palatino Linotype. That's about it for the Middle Age Hack channel for today. I'm Stuart. I hope you like and subscribe. Leave a comment if you think I'm full of it. I'm trying to build this channel as fast as I can so I can monetize it, and I cannot do that without you.